ACI's Audit Summer webcast series. I'm your host, Kathy Chambers. I'm so glad you're able to join us, and I hope you're ready to learn and have some fun as today's presenter, Dr. Hernan Murdock, speaks on Auditor Skepticism 101, the key elements. Dr. Murdock is a certified internal auditor and instructor for several of our audit, risk, and fraud courses, and he's also the Vice President of Content and Programming at ACI Learning. ACI Learning trains leaders in cybersecurity, audit, and information technology, delivering lifetime learning to over 250,000 engaged students, professionals, and organizations across 6 continents. Many of you attending today may know or have heard of the MIST Training Institute, or MISTI. MISTI has been training auditors, risk and compliance, fraud, and information security professionals worldwide for over 40 years. MISTI is now a part of and is being rebranded as ACI Learning. Check us out at acilearning.com and follow us on your favorite social media. We'd love to have you submit questions as we go along, so just put your questions in the question panel in the GoToWebinar on the right side of your screen. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you within a week. You can also download today's slides and any additional handouts by clicking on the links in the handouts panel. All right, let's bring in Dr. Hernan Murdock for today's webcast, Auditor Skepticism 101, the key elements. Hey, Dr. Hernan.
Hello, hello.
It's good to see you.
Nice to see you too.
So, you know, we've done a lot of Audit Pro TV courses together, so I think it's really cool that you and I get the opportunity to kick off this 4-part webcast series that we're doing this summer.
I'm very excited, and it's great working with you. It has been, and I'm sure it's going to be fun again.
So what are we going to chat about? What are we going to discuss today?
Today we'll talk about professional skepticism. It's a very important aspect of what internal auditors need to keep in mind. And it's a requirement, really, when you think about it. Is integral to what auditors do, and it impacts their mindset. It feeds off their skills and competencies, and it also impacts their actions and how they then deliver their services to their clients. So really central to what they do. One of the things that I like to highlight, for example, starting out, is that it really relates to the standards. The standards are really the guidance that auditors need to follow. So when we think about those, there are 2 in particular that I like to highlight at this point. Standard 1200, which talks about proficiency. Basically, what it talks about is making sure that auditors have the knowledge, the skills, and the competencies to do their job. So we need to start with that foundation. And skepticism is going to build off that. If you don't know what you're supposed to be doing, then we're going to have some serious issues, of course. So having the knowledge and skills and competencies is the foundation. And then the next standard I'd like to highlight has to do with due professional care. So now we're getting into territory around skepticism more closely, because what this standard 1220 talks about is the professional care. Care and the skill expected of an auditor, and someone who's going to be prudent in the work that they do. Remember, auditors are stewards. They are advocates. They are looking out for different constituencies, different stakeholders. And we have investors on one side, for example, who are investing in organizations and they expect a return and they don't want to see any scandals and have their investment diminished. We have employees whose livelihood depends on it. We have vendors who are again financially in many cases connected to the organization. We have communities, we have customers who want to make sure that what they are buying or what they're receiving from our organizations are safe, that they're going to work the way they're supposed to. So we have all these expectations, and then we bring in what I just described, which is standard 1220. Do professional care. They expect the auditors to be their advocate because the investors, the communities, the customers, the vendors, they don't have the visibility into the organization. So who looks out for them? The auditors do. So with that in mind, then, auditors need to look at every scenario, every engagement, and start to think in terms of, well, what exactly do I need to do? What's the extent of the work? We need to be clear about it, so we need to ask questions around it. And how thorough do we need to be? So the extent of the work is encapsulating that standard 1220, and auditors need to keep that in mind. Then we have the complexity of what we're reviewing. So for example, I'll just refer to, let's say, purchasing. Purchasing is something that just about every organization has, but it works differently in different organizations. It can be fairly simple in some cases. They buy only a few things, very straightforward. It can be pretty complex with a lot of purchases, a variety of different things that they buy, different cadence of purchases, sometimes a lot, sometimes a little. Maybe you buy domestically, internationally, from small, from large companies in different currencies. So purchasing can vary quite a bit. So as we're talking about skepticism, part of this is the auditor thinking in terms of, well, okay, this is the headline of what I'm supposed to be reviewing. What does that entail in my case? And then the extent of the work, the materiality of it is a key consideration as relates to this. And then we have another thing related to the probability of errors. Auditors are always tasked with keeping that in mind. What is the likelihood that there are going to be errors or fraud or non-compliance dynamics within the scope of my work? So these two standards definitely speak very loudly towards the need for skepticism, and I think it's a good starting point to this conversation today. The next item that I'd like to highlight has to do with curiosity. And it's interesting because if you think about how audit used to manifest itself, how it used to be done many years ago, a few decades, it was very scripted. And over the last few decades, I would say the last 3, definitely the last 2 decades, we've seen a very concerted effort to reimagine audit, to introduce the concept of curiosity into what we do. You cannot just follow checklists. You can't just follow scripts. They're helpful so you don't forget important things. But we need to make sure that we're always questioning, always curious. How does this work? So the example I gave you earlier when I was talking about purchasing. Purchasing, some people say purchasing is purchasing. Well, I learned very early in my career that that's not necessarily the case. Like I just explained previously, there are so many dynamics associated with it. And I spoke about, for example, volumes, where are the vendors, what currencies you're buying from. How about the systems? I've done reviews over the years where there are different systems that different divisions use, different countries use. And of course, in the back end, you have consolidation of results and how you're going to report on it. But if you're doing a review of purchasing, what are the flows? Curiosity is an integral part of understanding how it is done and where there may be issues. Like I just spoke about, errors, omissions, fraud, and noncompliance. You need to be curious. How does this work? When do things get done? Who does it? And of course, why do they do it at that point, in that place, in this manner? All of these questions fit into this whole umbrella of curiosity, which I think that we really need to underscore, highlight, really emphasize, because that's a very important aspect of what skepticism is about, because it'll help you move forward in the right direction as relates to this topic.
So Dr. Hernan, I've been taking some notes while you were chatting there, and I'd like to go back to proficiency and due professional care. So it seems like the same old, is just, it's not acceptable anymore, right? Like the auditors are going to really need to know how to adapt, understand the context before they review it.
Exactly. So this idea of rinse, repeat is really outdated. It's old-fashioned auditing. We don't do it that way anymore. We need to think in terms of how do we go about understanding what's going on in my context, in my organization, given the scope of my work and the objectives we're pursuing. Another thing that I'd like to highlight as relates to this dynamic around how you need to tailor the things that you're doing. If you think, for example, at the dynamic around purchasing, let's just stick with that one for a moment. If you think about purchasing 2 years ago versus last year versus this year versus next year. So if you are the auditor who's doing that same review with all the other variables that I already introduced and described, imagine a dynamic where the system that they used to use 3 years ago has been retired and now there's a new system. Imagine a dynamic where the product line that the company used to buy inventory for and manufacture or reprocess in any way, let's say that has changed, the product mix. Think in terms of where you're buying from. The dynamics around COVID and the pandemic reshuffled so many things for a lot of organizations around who are your vendors, where are they, and are they sustainable? Can they provide what you need when you need it with the quality that you expect? So even if you're doing the same review for the same organization, and I should probably pull the word same, because the way I'm describing it, it is no longer the same. It is you're reviewing the same process or activity, but the dynamics that underlie are different. Things have changed. The employees may have left, some may come in, the manager team may have moved on, so many variables. So even in the idea of that repeat review, there are many times dynamics that change things. So to your question, absolutely, yes, the same old, we have to be very careful. Now, one little caveat I'd like to throw in there. There are some reviews where you follow a bit of a script, and in many cases, these are probably mandated by, let's say, regulators. You may have different reviews that are follow kind of a pro forma approach, where you have this very specific work program you're supposed to follow. So they are, in some cases, very prescriptive, and you just do what that states. If that's the case, then that's the case. But by and large, we are talking about the largest volume of reviews that internal auditors get involved in for their reviews. Absolutely not. Not the same old. Sit down, think it through, talk to the right people. Absolutely important that we really think it through and make sure that we focus on what we need to focus on and that we do justice to that particular review.
You know,
So,
you also
as we
mentioned, oh, I'm sorry.
No,
You
go
also
ahead.
mentioned curiosity was also one of your main points there. And so I was, sitting here thinking about that. So you mentioned the checklist, but in certain circumstances, you need to kind of throw out the checklist and remain curious and adaptable depending on the situation.
Yes, exactly. So the checklist, I think of them as a good tool to make sure you don't forget something important, right? So let's say that you are the manager overseeing a particular engagement and you have your senior auditors on your staff that are doing the review. You want to make sure that they follow they get the information they're supposed to get. And if you're the one who prepared the work program, you may say, okay, let's have a checklist so that you when you go out and you talk to the client or you review documents or do observations and so on, that you're going to come back with information that we need. So you don't forget. The conversation may flow in different ways. Things may happen during those meetings, and you may leave out something important. So the checklist helps you remember. And also can be very helpful to create consistency. Imagine a case where you may have multiple auditors reviewing similar things with different people, and then you need to pull that information together and then compare and contrast. So a checklist can be very helpful. Similar thing with an interview. You're going to have a list of questions. You want to make sure the auditors don't forget to ask important things they need to find out. So these are great tools. The problem becomes when, well, a couple different scenarios. One of them is when that checklist or that list of questions are outdated. They were created a long time ago, and all the auditor does is go into the database or some old work paper package, pulls out these tools and say, oh, wow, this is great. I just have to go down the list and I'm done. Well, there may be things that have changed. So that checklist can be a great helper to start out with. But beyond that, ask the questions, take a look at what is pertinent in your case now, and then augment or adjust your questionnaire. I've been in situations where by understanding what's going on in that particular area, some questions are not relevant. So it really is not a good show of professionalism going into an interview with a client and asking questions that are really, in many cases, clearly irrelevant. If you need to corroborate, that's one thing. And one of the things that I've told auditors all along is if there are certain questions, you need to know why you're asking, number one. But the other thing might be telling the client why you're asking a question. If they are going to hear that question and conclude that you really don't know what you're talking about, you don't know what goes on in this operation, and now you're basically wasting my time as a client, that is going to create other issues. So one of the things that the auditors may want to consider is prefacing the question, explaining why they're asking it. It may be very obvious, but I need to ask this question because, and then explain the purpose of the question. Now the client understands that you know, and you have a purpose for asking the question. So again, a little bit nuance there, but very important as well to make sure that we ask the pertinent questions and that we're able to start the whole engagement in solid footing. So absolutely, curiosity, very important. Asking questions, who, what, when, where, how, and never forget why. So those are very important ways of organizing your thoughts and understanding what's going on. Now, another thing that I'd like to highlight as relates to professional skepticism that really drives this dynamic quite a bit is evidence. A lot of what auditors do is collect, analyze, interpret, and then report on the evidence that they collect. But let's start in terms of what kinds of evidence that you're going to collect. And there are different attributes around it. So we can, for example, do interviews, right? So you can get testimonial information from your clients, and that is very valid, definitely commonly used. But there may be times when we want to do something one notch higher than that, right? But before I move to that, let's think in terms of who you're asking. So in some cases, the individual who you're asking may not have full and in-depth knowledge of that process like they could or should. It could be a manager, for example. This individual does not do the day-to-day work. So out of courtesy and to follow protocol, we may speak with this individual. There are certain questions that are pertinent for the manager, but there are other questions we need to direct to the operators. So who you're talking to is important, right? So we have this matter around testimonial information or evidence. Then we move into observation. So beyond hearing what people tell you and who tells you what, you may also want to go see for yourself. We've had some challenges with the pandemic and COVID and where people can travel or not. So we've had some interesting changes happen as relates to that. Part of that is using cameras, using drones, various things like recordings and so on. All of these type of things have helped in many cases to observe things that you could not physically be there to see for yourself. You can see it through the eyes of a camera. So be mindful. And again, part of the skepticism topic we're addressing today is that image that is captured, is it real time? Is it do we have a clear date and time stamps on it so we know that what we're looking is at the right time that we expect? Is it a feed or a picture? You can see that there's nothing or no one perhaps on a road or an alley. Is that actually a moving image or is that just a still image? Be careful about those kinds of things. So this is skepticism once again. But it can easily happen. You don't see anyone, and you don't see anyone for a long time, and you think that, oh, that's empty. Well, it is because that's a picture, not a streaming image. Be mindful. We have, for example, then the next thing will be, do they know that you're watching or do they not know you're watching? And we need to be mindful about how they may see you as a spying of sorts. But in many cases, it's best that they know you're watching. And in some cases, it may be a good idea that they don't know. Because one of the things we learn is that people's behavior can sometimes be changed to please the observer. So they are careless. Use an example rather than just give you a hypothetical. I've done a number of construction audits over the years, and in several instances, what we noted because of temperature, because of rain, because of different dynamics, expediency and rushing and so on, sometimes the procedures were not followed like they should, right? We have, in many cases, expectations around a helmet, reflective vest, you have, belts to lift heavy loads, you have gloves, you have steel-toe boots, you have all of these requirements in construction sites. I've also done reviews in laboratories where I saw some variation of that with things like goggles and gloves and so on. So the expectation is there, the procedures are laid out, the training in many cases has been very clear and in many cases repeated. And then you observe and you realize that in certain cases they take shortcuts. They were supposed to put some cones down and put up a flag and let people know that the truck is going to back up, but because they're in a hurry, they don't. So if they know the auditor is observing, they may say, oh, heads up everybody, the auditor is watching, make sure you follow procedures like you're supposed to. But when the auditor is not watching, you may realize that that's what they do. So to see the work in its natural environment, that is something to also consider. Should they not know that you're watching? So back to my example. Some construction reviews and some of these lab reviews that I did, you go to a corner, one on a perch, the observation tower or something like it, and you just observe for a while. And then you start to see what really goes on. And not only do it like in the middle of the morning, middle of the afternoon when they're really into their routine. Sometimes you want to look right at the beginning of the shift, right before the end of a shift. Again, different time periods may give you different results as well. So be mindful and be careful and keep that in mind. Then we have analytical procedures and document inspection. So what documents are you looking at? Are these current? Are they old? Are they originals? Are they copies? Could they have been manipulated, doctored, changed in any way? So we want to be careful about those things. So reports, that's another important thing too. Is that report complete? Is it accurate? How do you know? So these are very important questions around evidence, the collection of it, the analysis of it, and how we conclude on it. If you don't collect the right evidence, everything downstream may be corrupted. If you don't analyze it right, everything below that might also be corrupted. If you don't analyze it using critical thinking and really probe through it, you may come up with the wrong conclusion. So again, these things depend on each other. So evidence, the amount of it, the type of it is very important. Another thing that I like to highlight is, for example, the sampling that we use. What method of sampling are we going to use? So I'll come back to that. But when we're talking about evidence, these are the questions and these are the kinds of things that auditors need to also keep in mind.
Dr. Hernan, how can that evidence be compromised? I'm sure there are many ways that could happen.
Yes, so a little bit of different things. So if you're thinking, for example, in the case of documents, and what could happen is that the auditor is asking for documents from an individual who has the ability to prepare documents that look a certain way. So the integrity of that evidence can be a problem. So that's related to documents as an example. If you're looking at, for example, data, the same thing can happen. One of the things that we always advocate for is the auditor getting flat files or just an extract of the data from the system, and then the auditor or someone within that unit or someone that they really know and trust is the one who does any kind of data manipulation. So to explain what I mean by this, imagine a case where a client that you're asking some data from, this individual downloads information and puts it into an Excel spreadsheet. And then this individual starts to sort this way, sort that way, put headers, put footers, put subtotals, and labeling things and so on. And then they're going to send it to you, all nice and pretty, so that you can then do your work. The problem with that is that they can either wittingly, unwittingly, willfully, or not pull records out. They can make the numbers different. And how will you know? So a couple different things you can do. One of them is to compare the totals with another source to make sure that nothing was pulled out of the record that you are reviewing. But better yet, just ask for the information yourself, understand what each column and row is about, and make sure you put your headers and that then you do the analysis. I'll give you another example of a case where doing a review, and this is not just a singular incident or example. Several times asking for information. This is how I learned about what I just described. You ask for information and you're waiting for them to send it over to you. And when you call to follow up, they say, well, I'm almost done with it. And you say, well, what do you mean by done? And you say, well, I am cleaning it up for you. So what do you mean by cleaning up? Well, like I said, headers, footers, subtotals, make sure that everything is in order for you. And anything that doesn't make sense, make sure that you don't get distracted or confused by it because it doesn't really apply, right? So I just want to make sure that what you get is a clean report. And of course, all of the concerns come right to the surface. And that's when I realized that that was not the way to go, is making sure that you do all of that, because they can pull things out that you need to know about. And while they maybe try to do you a favor, and I appreciate that part of it, but part of our job is to understand what's happening in the truest sense. So from that perspective, be very mindful about people who try to be helpful, but it takes away from your ability to do your work and that due professional care aspect of what we're talking about here. The next thing is about alertness. So this has to do with be on the lookout. So part of this is, and this goes back to due professional care as well to some extent, where we don't want to walk into the situation with biases or in an accusatory way, right? We want to find out what the facts are. So we don't want to assume innocence. We don't want to assume guilt. We don't want to assume that they are correct or wrong. We want to find out what's going on. So be alert to the potential, though. That can always happen. So this is a bit of a gray line, but something that we need to emphasize. When it comes to skepticism, you need to make sure you always have this professional skepticism with you. As you enter a situation doing a review, whatever it may be, however extensive or not, always be on the lookout. Be alert to the possibility of errors. that could be cost. The system may cost them, the process may cost them, the individuals in the process, the other parties that connect to this process, maybe vendors and customers. There could be errors. There could be neglect as well. Someone who chooses not to do something that's important. So why don't they do it? Lack of training, lack of motivation, being overworked, sabotage. There are a lot of different reasons why this could happen, so we must be alert to neglect. And then the next one I like to highlight is a potential for fraud, which I think of, not just think of, but by definition is intentional. Someone who is trying to gain something and they are covering up what they're doing or what they know without letting others know about it for some benefit. So from that perspective, then if we think about the potential for fraud, screaming very loudly for the need for skepticism. So errors, neglect, fraud. Keep those three words in mind.
Dr. Hernan, you mentioned fraud multiple times. I was just thinking about, is there an example that you can give when Alertness helped uncover something like fraud or something similar?
Yes, there are so many instances over the years, not that my focus has been fraud as an auditor, but I have encountered situations, me personally, and some of the people working on my teams. So one of the things that come to mind to your question had to do with looking at purchasing cards, transactions. And the process had a problem with segregation of duty. So what was happening was that the information was coming in, the secretary was receiving the documentation about the purchases, and the person was supposed to review it was not doing a thorough job. So again, my job was to review and to verify that everything was in order. I want to verify that that's the case, and if not, then of course, then we move into the next mode. So as I was doing my work, reviewing, and a lot of it is footing and cross-footing and just checking report totals, making sure that everything was accounted for, noticed that there were some discrepancies in the numbers, and I could not figure out what was happening. So I went to the source documentation. So what I was working from was what was provided to me in that office. And then since I could not make it work, I inquired about the source document, obtained those from the vendor, and as I compared the two documents, the one from the vendor tied out, the one that was provided to me did not. And what was basically happening was that the secretary was making personal purchases using the P-card mechanism and was taking personal items from that. So she was basically cutting out on the report that was given to me, the physical report. She was just very low tech, right? Just cutting it out, making another copy, putting it on top of the receipts, and then putting it in a cabinet where I subsequently came in and did the review. So because of that procedure, and the numbers not tying out, is how I realized that something seemed to be wrong, going back to the next level of evidence gathering, and that's how I uncovered the issue. So once again, it's a matter of what evidence you're working with, what you're concluding, and whether or not something may be wrong. Lesson learned there is whenever you can, go to the source documents. So we were working from what was provided to us, and quite often that is enough. But now that you know that this is one of the ways that manipulation can take place, you learn. And you move forward, and you really underscore the importance of going with original documents whenever you can. So I learned, and I share with my people who like to listen to me.
Dr. Hernan, you should have known that I was going to ask about fraud, because that is definitely one of my favorite topics. I had to throw a fraud question in there. What else should we think about?
It's unfortunate, but fraud is a juicy topic just about every time, so no worries there.
What else do we need to think about when it comes to skepticism?
So let's think of it in a slightly different way now. Let's think about how this relates to the project timeline or the phases of a typical engagement. So we have three phases. We have the planning phase, we have fieldwork, and we have reporting. And as we think about each one of them individually, so let's think about, for example, the planning phase. So how does skepticism apply? Some of the things that we have been talking about definitely applies here, because part of what we're looking at then is how do we make sure we understand what the objectives are for this engagement? What's the scope of our work? What are some of the sources of information that are at our disposal? And sources can be individuals, can be data, can be facilities. All of these things are part of the resources that we have. And of course, the knowledge and the skill of the people working on our engagement. So all of these things should be considered. We want to make sure we do a good job, and that begs for making it a robust review. You don't want to be in a situation where you do a review, you did not dig sufficiently, and after you're done and you sign off and the report goes out, something major is uncovered. It definitely will undermine the credibility of the auditor. So from that perspective, then, being robust in what we do is important. Highlighting some of the major scandals that in many cases have also, I don't want to say tarnish, but definitely raised questions around the depth of the work of the auditors. And of course, we're talking about skepticism because it relates to it. Things like the scandals many years ago with Enron and WorldCom really put a spotlight on what auditors do, both external auditors and internal auditors, and even regulators for that matter. We have Wells Fargo, we have Theranos, and what happened there. And then we have Volkswagen and a few others. So again, I just mentioned these just as a few examples of why this matters so much. It matters within the organization because of our credibility with our constituents within, but some of these issues can really go out into the larger market and really create a problem for us as individuals and for the entire organization, and drag down investors and customers and vendors and so many other parties. So very important that during the planning phase that we are skeptic sufficiently in terms of how we analyze the dynamics, understand the dynamics, and prepare to review. The next piece it's about fieldwork. So now we're going into the mode of looking in terms of how do we verify that some of these things are actually happening or not happening. That is kind of how I usually frame my mind around this. It is verifying that the objectives are being pursued and making reasonable progress towards their achievement, looking at the risks to see if they're happening or not, looking at the controls to see if they're effective or not. So what do we need to do to answer those questions? Briefly, we spoke about sampling. So let me go back to that point. So if we're thinking in terms of verifying, for example, that a particular risk has happened or not, you may have to ask different questions about what kind of records you may need to look at. A lot of auditors default to sampling, and quite often random sampling in a non-statistical way for resource limitations, expediency, and maybe habit in some cases. But part of what I like to highlight is why we need to be very careful. So if you go with random, non-statistical sampling, and maybe a sample size of, let's say, 30 or 50 items or something like it, are you testing the risk or are you testing the control? In some cases, if you really look closely at what the auditors are doing, they may be actually just testing the controls to see whether or not a control was applied to a particular transaction. And that may be what you need to prove. If that's the case, well, fine, you got it. But think of a case, and I like to use the example of split transactions, because that is a very good example of where random sampling really doesn't provide the results that you think you're getting. So the dynamics are like this. You have a process where you have approval thresholds. Let's say that I have a threshold of $50,000 to make purchases, since we're talking about purchasing in general in this session today. And let's say that you, Kathy, you have an approval threshold up to $100,000, and then there's a manager who will then review any purchases above $100,000. So let's say a purchasing comes through that needs to be made, and it's for $75,000. And let's say that one of my performance metrics is that I process transactions, I look really busy, so I want to make sure that those are booked by me, and maybe I want to use certain vendors because maybe they're great vendors, but either way, I'm supposed to abide by this 50,000 threshold. The need comes in for 75,000. I'm supposed to pass it over to you for processing, or at least for you to review and say, okay, this is how we're going to process it, and you're going to take care of it. Sometimes what happens, people split the transaction. 50,000 and 25, or they'll do 45 and 30. But either way, they try to stay within their threshold. Maybe the system is blocking them. So they split it. Now, if you were to look at any one transaction, they'll probably meet that test of, did Hernan review it and perform it? Because I have authority up to 50. But the approval thresholds are supposed to drive certain dynamics and limit how much I do. So from that perspective, then by splitting it, I circumvented the control. This can be a very big problem. I'm describing it from the purchasing side, but imagine from the approval side. Let's say that I am only supposed to approve up to 50. And I am now splitting the transaction, maybe instructing someone to do it that way, and I am then going to approve them both. Well, once again, we're circumventing the controls. That's not the way it's supposed to work. So any one transaction looks okay. The problem is that in the aggregate, they're not. So sampling can provide very important answers and very important information. But by not doing data analytics and maybe getting closer to 100% testing, we may be missing these kind of things. So very important to keep that in mind when it comes to sampling. What methodology you're following. We have statistical, non-statistical, random, we have judgmental. There are so many different ways we can do it. We need to align the sampling or the testing, the population we're going to look at with the risk. Very important. Now let's go back to planning for a moment, because there are a couple of things I'd like to highlight too. The risk assessment that we do also needs to be done in a very robust way. I spoke earlier about the questionnaire, the checklist, and so on. Another tool that we use abundantly and that really drives skepticism and the need for it and how we manifest it is the risk assessment. So we need to, once again, be open-minded, think about different scenarios, talk to different individuals, collect the necessary information so the risk assessment will be as accurate, complete, and reliable as possible. Because based on that, we're then going to decide what procedures we're going to follow. Now we move into fieldwork. If you did not do a good job with the risk assessment, a lot of cascading things may be compromised. The next thing I'd like to highlight has to do with reporting. Once again, how are we presenting the information? So at this point, things are pretty much done. We want to be fair and balanced and so on. We want to make sure we present things in the right way. So part of what we have to keep here, and the topic that I like to use to demonstrate, to show how skepticism fits into this, has to do, for example, with the challenge that some auditors have with trying to build positive relationships with their clients. Whether you work within the organization or you're an external contractor coming in to do the review, we have this overarching, let's call it mandate or goal in the profession. Goal is probably a better word to describe the need to build relationships. We don't want to burn bridges. We don't want to create animosity with our clients. We need to be firm, yes, but we want to build positive relationships. In their report, are we presenting things the right way? Have we tested things in the right way so that we can do and follow what I started out today's session with in terms of do professional care? You should not weaken the rigor of your work because you're trying to be nice to the client. That is something that can really become a problem for you. So these are very important attributes that we also need to keep in mind.
Dr. Hernan, how have attributes kind of evolved over time, and what do you see for the future there?
Yes, so let's talk a bit about that. Yes, so attributes. So there are three key things with that, right? So the first element here is the attributes themselves, and that has to do with the knowledge that the auditor has. So that's why training is so important. Reading, talking to other auditors. How did you do this? How did you do that? What did you learn? What will we do differently next time? These knowledge and skill elements are very important in how we can display and apply professional skepticism. Then we have the ability of the auditor. So knowing is one thing, but being able to do it is another, right? So the ability of the auditor to take these ideas into practice. So some of the things that I've been talking about, for example, sampling and about the evidence and so on, all of these things are part of that. Now, we all have the next thing, which is mindset. So we have the skills and the knowledge, and we have the abilities. You go to training and you review your procedures and all of that, and you're comfortable with what you are supposed to do. You have the right mindset. So the auditor needs to act with good faith. One of the things that I like to emphasize always is fairness. In many cases, auditors are criticized for being perceived as being unfair. We only focus on the bad things. We only look for the bad things. We only talk about the bad things. So I like to encourage auditors to also be attentive to what the client is doing well and mention that. But don't spend so much time and don't give so much effort and don't give so much coverage to what's going well that you neglect to look at what's not going well. So it requires balance. We need to be fair. And that's it. If we do that, we'll be in fine shape. The next thing has to do with, oh, by the way, another thing with this in terms of the good faith element in the mindset has to do with how do we pursue the evidence and how we get it. So let me, again, we're talking about skepticism, right? So let's say that you're asking for anything. You're asking for an audience with an individual. You're asking for documents or data. You're asking for the ability to visit a facility and observe things, any of those kinds of things. You ask for it. Let's just talk about, for example, that you ask for some documents and they can't locate it. And they tell you, well, we can't find it. We have some administrative problems. It probably is around. We just haven't archived it. We haven't filed it yet. Can you pull another record? Can you look at another item? Be careful. Because it could be that they have sloppy administrative procedures and it is in a pile someplace they just need to file it. But it could also be that that document doesn't exist. Imagine a case where you're doing a review of vendors and you're looking for the documentation that shows that they demonstrated due diligence, reviewed the characteristics of the vendor in terms of real organization, licensed, registered, physical location. The principals of the vendor are not connected to the organization. There's no conflict of interest involved there, that they have the financial solvency, data and technological soundness with their systems if we're going to have data flows or they're going to do any kind of work that involves our data or our customers and vendors. So if we have the need to review a file, like a vendor file, and we ask for it and they can't produce it and they ask us to look for another record, is it because they can't locate it or because it never existed? You could be looking at a fraudulent vendor situation. And by you just pulling another record, you may miss it. Contracts, same thing. You ask for a contract, they can't locate it. Is it that they can't locate it or it doesn't exist? You're looking at payroll. You're looking for an individual who's supposed to be getting paid. Is this person really on leave or does this person don't exist? So again, it's looking at the persuasiveness of the evidence and whether or not you are staring at a potential issue and you don't see it because you're either too trusting in that case. So be very careful about that. Now, the third thing that I like to highlight has to do with the action. So I gave you some examples already in terms of that robust risk assessment, where we need to make sure we ask the right questions and we're thorough as much as we can be. But supervision is another important part of this. So some of my remarks allude to the fact that we need to create that culture within the team where we are asking the questions, where we understand our duty of professional care and proficiency, where we are curious and we encourage curiosity. When we have tools that we are going to hand to our team to use or have in our databases as part of our procedures, we want to be careful that they don't just run there, do it, and move on. I already spoke about that. We need to make sure they're questioning. Does this make sense? Does this cover everything? Is there something missing? Should there be something else we do? Is there something we can do differently, right? All of those things are part of that supervision and creating the right culture within the team and the department where we have a questioning mind. Quality reviews, very important as well. Making sure we're thorough in terms of what we're looking at. So I've been talking quite a bit about the auditor and what he or she does. But then we have on the other side our internal quality assurance reviews. And are those reviewers also skeptical? They need to also check the work of their colleagues, the people within their own department, so that they are not letting things go by that may be incorrect. And another thing I'd like to highlight is in terms of the dynamics around making it safe. So I spoke about supervision and curiosity, but do people feel that it's okay to question things? In some organizations, the supervisory style or the management style is just do as I say, don't ask any questions. That can be very damaging because what can happen is that the others stop thinking. and we don't want that. Skepticism, one of the best cures for being overly trusting is making sure we embed skepticism in what we do. And a great idea of how we do it and what we do and so on can come from anyone. So we want to encourage that type of dynamic.
Dr. Hernan, you had mentioned culture, and I know that's so important. When it comes to action, what can the internal audit departments do to create more of that safe environment?
Yes, part of that is expectations. Let's start with the expectations meeting. Actually, let me go back even further. When you hire the auditors, we want to make sure that that is part of our values. We talk about it when the auditor is hired. Now, if you have the auditors already in your department, then that becomes part of what we can do with our staff meetings. We can make it part of our evaluations when we do our check-ins with our auditors, when we are having our staff meetings and just talking about decisions that we're making that may not be related to a particular audit, but just in general. What do you think? And just go around the table or around the room. Now, when we get into the specific engagement, the expectations meeting, once again, reiterating, everyone is part of this team. We want to hear from you. Here are some of the thoughts we have. Let's say I'm now going to play the role of the manager. Here are some of the thoughts I have. This is some of the information I have about this. What do you think? What do we look at? How do we look at it? And do we make sure we have a purpose for everything? And if you don't know the purpose, let's talk about it, because as you understand it, you may have some great ideas. I would love to hear it. So we can definitely encourage it during all of these points. And then during fieldwork, once we're testing, once again, what are you seeing? Does it make sense? Do you have any questions? What could be, once you start to see issues, if there are, why do you think this is happening? So making sure that this questioning mindset is front and center to what we do all along.
All right, thanks so much, Hernan, for talking to us about how auditors can deal with skepticism to help further their career and evolve over time. Thanks for answering my questions. For our viewers out there, if you have questions, be sure to enter them now in the chat panel, just on the right-hand side of your screen. But before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Audit Pro TV. Audit Pro TV is a subscription-based, on-demand audit training that's effective and engaging. A one-year subscription costs less than that 3-day classroom course, so you can always access the training you need when you need it. Visit ACIlearning.com to learn more about Audit Pro TV. And Dr. Hernan, we got some exciting news the other day that in classroom training, I'm trying to say this, how do I say this? In-person classroom training is back. See, it's been so long, I can't even get it out.
Okay, yeah. So in classroom training, definitely an important thing. If we can, get together safely, that is such a great way to connect, to talk, to exchange ideas and impressions. We learn from each other. Progress through sharing is a very important aspect of auditing. So when we get together, we get to talk about things and we compare the theory with the practice and how we apply it in different environments. So absolutely positive things to think about, and whenever possible, it's a great way to go about it. Now, there are other ways that we can also learn, right? We can also have more of a self-paced environment. One of the things that I would like to suggest to people who do that is to also think in terms of, well, as you're going through the material, make sure you stop and reflect. This, again, feeds back into skepticism, of course, but think in terms of, what am I learning? How does this apply to me? Sometimes we're so busy working our way through a program that we don't stop and reflect on what we have learned and how it applies to me. So definitely in the classroom, definitely self-paced, however, wherever, as much as possible, take time to think it through, because that's a very important part of what this is all about. Auditing is a thinking game.
So in December, ACI Learning, we're going to offer a week of in-person training courses in Orlando, Florida. Now that's right next to Disney World. If you're eager to get back to that live classroom training, this is the perfect opportunity to do that. Just visit Disney and earn your CPE credits. We have a variety of 2, 3, 4, and 5-day audit courses to choose from. So there is something for everyone. That sounds like fun. Dr. Hernan, have you been to Disney?
I have a few times, enjoyed it every time. It's a great place to go. Yes, absolutely.
All right, so our viewers have sent in some questions, Hernan, so let's get to those. Okay. Let's see, our first one is from Lillian. She's in Austin, Texas. Lillian writes, what are some tools and tips for the beginning auditor regarding skepticism? We throw out these buzzwords, but what does it really mean? What should the new auditor look for And what should they do to ensure that they maintain skeptical?
Very good question. I like it. Yes. So different tools that we can apply. One of them has to do, for example, with environment. So I would say make sure that we bring in the auditors. So many times, and you were talking just now about in-person classroom teaching and training, and I've done a lot of those over the years. And one of the conversations we've had many times is for new auditors, how in some organizations, they are just given the work program and said, okay, go do this. And in some cases, they just don't know why they're doing it. They don't really have a good understanding of what's happening. They just know that they need to pull X number of items from a population and look for these different attributes and see what you find. And while that's a good drill and it helps you with documentation and so on, sometimes they don't really think it through. They don't understand what's happening. So one of the things that I would like to add to what I described earlier and to Lillian's question is that one of the things we can do is help new auditors explain to them the scope, the objectives of the review so that they understand what they're doing. They may still end up just doing that mechanical work as they practice and do their documentation, which is integral to what we do as auditors, but they understand the context and they can start asking questions. And then the manager engaging with that individual. When I say manager, could be the team lead, could be the supervisor, but the person who's in charge of that engagement, just asking questions. So what do you think about it? You see any patterns, anything that you're concerned about? These kinds of questions start to warm up the auditor to this idea of skepticism and to have a questioning mind. Another important thing is to not go with the easiest information to obtain. So sometimes what will happen is that we'll just talk to the person who's right there, but that may not be the best person for the information we need. So you may need to talk to other individuals. You may need to look for additional records or information. You may want to, for example, observe at unusual times. And this can be a physical observation. It could also be when you're doing data analytics. Some of the fraud dynamics that have been uncovered have had to do with transactions happening, for example, outside of normal work hours. Transactions that were performed through a VPN connection or external connection of some kind. An operator who was supposed to be on leave or on vacation. Those kinds of things. So once again, we're looking for the different. So as we're doing our work, part of that needs to be always questioning, well, how can something happen here that is not the standard expected outcome? Errors, omissions, neglect, fraud. So looking at different scenarios, all of that can help us tremendously to make sure we practice skepticism and that we have a questioning mindset from the beginning.
All right, and Deidre from Tallahassee, thank you, Deidre, for your question. How important is the research part of planning to being able to exercise auditor skepticism? Are there different things they should include as normal elements, for example, trending risk, latest types of fraud, etc.?
Yes. So the research part of it is very important in the planning phase because part of what you're trying to do is understand the dynamics around the scope, the topic, scope, and objectives. So, or objectives and scope. So you're trying to basically understand the dynamic, the parameters of your review, and part of that is going to be based on research. Some of the research will be looking at records. Some of it might be due to interviews with individuals. And once again, talk to different people and always be attentive to what they say, what they don't say, and for those who say something, how they say it, because they can have different dynamics play out here too. What they're telling you sounds good, but it's really not right. So you collect information, and none of this is in a vacuum. The information you collect relates to what they tell you. And what they tell you also, in light of that, research, of course, the information you got, and what they don't tell you, and what was their demeanor, if you can assess that in some way. So all of these dynamics help you tremendously. With research, a very common recommendation also is to look at prior year's work papers. Very important to do. I highly recommend it. However, we have to be careful once again to understand that every engagement could have different objectives and scope. So from that perspective then, what they looked at may or may not be similar to what you're looking at now. I mentioned earlier different systems, different people, management, volumes, all of these dynamics could be different. So you look at the prior work papers, but you still need to understand what you're looking at this point in time and make sure you make the adjustments. So these are some of the things from that research perspective that I think are very important. Now, the third thing, and I believe you mentioned fraud in your question, The organization should also build a database. So, I mentioned the organization, but we also can benefit from other schemes. So I've given you some examples just now of different things that I've witnessed over the years, me personally or my team members and so on. But part of that is building this database so that as part of our research, we think in terms of how can fraud occur here? And we, in some cases, feed off that database, whether it's from the organization or from the outside. How can fraud happen here? That should be part of our fraud incorporation, looking at the potential for fraud in the review that we're doing. So I think that's a very helpful thing as well.
For our viewers, I appreciate all the questions that you're sending in. We've got 5 minutes left, so we're going to get to as many of them as possible. Let's start with Rebecca. I have experienced some very painful and unnecessary wordsmithing peer reviews. What thoughts, tips can you share that I can pass along to the entourage, a review of the audit and not just a wordsmithing experience?
Words matter. That is definitely true. They matter on the way in and they matter on the way out when we're reporting and communicating results. So part of that is be very careful. Similar to what I said earlier in terms of what they say and what they don't say and how they say it, what they do say. Part of that is also how they respond in written form. We need to be very mindful what they're telling us in written form and how they're in some cases looking at the wording. This is an important thing as well because sometimes things are written in such a way that they're confusing. Sometimes they're confusing because it's a poor writer. Sometimes they're confusing by design. The individual doesn't want to provide thorough details. And as an auditor, you need to be careful about it. I've been in situations where we haggle over a comma or a period, whether something is in quotes or not, whether something is EG or IE, those kinds of things. It matters. Again, there's no easy answer necessarily. Is being attentive and careful. Sometimes when you write your report and they respond to it, sometimes they'll also write in such a way that they're not really committing to fixing anything. So we also want to be careful about that so that we apply skepticism to that and read between the lines is one way to think of it. Is are they really not committing to fixing it? If this is a big issue, they need to be more explicit in their response. So be on the lookout for it. I will agree with the question. You have to, in some cases, be very attentive to the detail and the nuance in the words because words matter and they, in some cases, can they may be attempting to convey something that they're trying to hide from you. So you have to be careful. Yes.
All right, so Lorraine writes, what is the best way of engaging the team in asking questions?
There are different ways of asking questions. Some of them are going to be the open-ended question, which is the one that I prefer because they elicit a conversation. The person will then elaborate and describe and so on what you're asking about. Close-ended questions also have their place. So you may need to corroborate, you may need to verify, you may need to get a specific fact related to something. It could be a number, an amount, a date, a location, a name, a title, a system, something like it that you need a very specific piece of information. So close-ended questions can be very helpful there. But by and large, the open-ended questions are usually the way we want to go. You still need to manage that conversation and make sure that it doesn't drift too far away where you're then going to lose time by them talking about things that are not relevant. So one of the tips that I usually share is that if that's what's happening, remember, it's your meeting and you have a limited amount of time. So if they're starting to drift too far away, then you may need to bring them back. Don't be too quick in every instance because as they're talking and elaborating, there may be something important that is brought up. So be a little bit patient, but if you start to get to the point where you realize that this is really not being very productive and is drifting too far away from the objective of this meeting, a close-ended question can really be helpful. So can you go back to that point you raised a moment ago and can you give me an name, place, date, amount, something like that? Or did I get it right when you said that just want to make sure that that's correct? And it'll give you a yes or a no. That's a close-ended question. And now you can then reframe the question and say, okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to be clear about that. So can you tell me more about, and then now you'd redirect them. So these type of approaches can be very helpful. Now, I spoke earlier about the prefacing the question, why you're asking. That's a very important thing as well. Always be respectful. Always be professional in your questioning. Try not to sound accusatory. As we spoke about skepticism, it's for you to know, and it's part of your mindset. But you don't want to talk and ask questions in an accusatory way. Be very careful about that aspect of it, because that is counterproductive.
All right, we've got time for one last question. This is in from Anthony in Brazil. With large frauds or undue care, the auditor was accustomed to do the same work each year and did not apply skepticism. Auditor rotation is a good control, correct?
Auditor retention. Okay. So the individual doing the same procedure and knowing the ins and outs of the process that they're reviewing. So yes, in principle, it's a very good thing because that depth of knowledge can be very helpful in understanding some of the failure points, weaker points in that particular process or activity, and where you need to go, right? That expertise, we spoke about the knowledge of the and skill of the auditor. However, we have to be careful that they don't become complacent. And that is an important thing related to skepticism as well, where you have done it so many times that you just follow this script. You don't really digging enough. You're not imagining enough, and that can become a problem, because if the client knows exactly what you're going to look at, how deep you're going to go, what topics you look at and which ones you don't, which amounts you look at and which ones you don't, etc., then that can also create issues around, especially around fraud, where now they know that you're not going to look in this area. That's how I'm going to direct my fraud. So that can be a concern there as well. But I agree that accumulated knowledge is very valuable, and the relationship with our clients. But a good practice in many organizations is to rotate auditors periodically. Part of it is what I just described in terms of them becoming complacent or becoming too friendly with the client. That's a potential issue there. But from a cross-training perspective, if you bring other auditors in, now you have other people who know about this process as well, and they can also cover for each other. It's becomes a learning experience for more individuals, and you create more job diversity and variety. So from that perspective, that should be something to consider. So I agree that there's some benefit to it, but just keep in mind some of these other elements that you may also want to give some thought to.
All right, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Hernan, and thank you, everyone in the audience, for your questions. We've run out of time here for this webcast. For Dr. Hernan Murdock, I'm Kathy Chambers. Hope to see you again on our next webcast.